Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rob McMonigal, and I'm the sector lead at Toronto's Economic Development Division, supporting the growth of the green industries. Also present here today with me is Susan Vegas, who is the lead on this initiative for the city. Our event today is very much about enhancing growth and engaging the green industry along our path towards a net zero city. The agenda has been structured around three key topics. Number one, what the City of Toronto is doing to deal with the climate crisis. Number two, how green industries around the world are organizing and working with local governments to maximize the economic opportunities that environmental challenges present. And finally, how we in Toronto can accelerate local economic growth and the adoption of environmental solutions through effective collaboration between industry, governments, and academia. And I'll have some additional thoughts to share with you shortly on this, but for now, I'm going to turn this back over to Elisa Kelly, who's the Director of Research at Foresight Canada, to run you through some of the details of today's event. And Foresight Canada has been engaged by the city, on this first stage of the initiative, and Elisa is facilitating today's event.
Thank you so much, Rob. Hi, everyone. As Rob mentioned, I'm Elisa Kelly. I'm the Director of Research at Foresight Canada. I'm joined here by my colleague at Foresight, Heather Crusher-Tier, who's our Director of Innovation Challenges. Foresight's very excited to be working with the City of Toronto on this exciting initiative to explore green sector collaboration in Toronto. For those of you who may not be familiar with Foresight, we are Canada's clean tech accelerator. We bring partners together to identify, commercialize, and adopt the clean technologies needed to address today's most urgent climate challenges. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and you will get to introduce them shortly. But before we begin, I just, with gratitude and respect, would like to acknowledge the lands on which the City of Toronto operates and on which many of us are meeting today are the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Before we continue, I would like to mention that this session is being recorded and it would be made publicly available afterwards. All attendees will be sent a link to the recording, so any colleagues who were unable to attend may view this at a later time. The agenda for today's session, first we'll hear a bit about Toronto's green sectors, how they're growing, and the context behind this initiative, as well as a bit about local economic collaboration. We'll hear about climate change in Toronto and the Transform TO Net Zero strategy. Then we'll hear from our speakers, and we'll have a roundtable chat about industry collaboration in Toronto and in the global context. We'll then talk about next steps in this industry consultation process that the City of Toronto is taking and how we want the green sectors to get involved. And if any questions come up during the webinar, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer them throughout the session. And if we don't get to you, we'll follow up with an answer afterwards. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Rob to tell us about Toronto's green sectors. You're welcome.
And I'm very visual, so I'm going to show you a few slides as I talk. And this first one is from an old sci-fi disaster film. And I must admit that sometimes nowadays I feel like I'm living in one with all the things that have been happening around the world. And this is definitely an exciting time to be in the green industries, both here in Toronto and globally. And we're dealing with our own Godzilla. And like Godzilla, it's something that we created. We are in the midst of perhaps the largest economic transformation in history. And it's not being driven just by technology advances, which are absolutely stunning and amazing, but it's the need for change to ensure that the very survival of our society and the world as we know it. So like Godzilla, we've got huge challenges, but there is no option but success. And while the challenges are pretty immense, I think the business opportunities that we're looking at is absolutely staggering if you start looking at the numbers of what has to be done. And these are some numbers, that the city of Toronto has pulled out, okay, on the growth of the sector in Toronto. Okay. And for the green industries, we're growing at twice the rate of the overall economy in Toronto. We're currently, next slide, we're currently employing over 60,000 workers. So very, very impressive considering where we've been over the last 10 or 15 or even 20 years. Yet this growth is only really the starting point, okay, to resolving the climate crisis, the plastic pollution crisis, the resource crisis, all these crises that are seeming to be heading our way very quickly. If you look at the net zero strategy report, okay, it projects anywhere from 40 to 50,000 jobs have to be created just to deal with the building retrofits and the infrastructure investments that are needed. Okay, so that's doubling the size of the green industries just by that one initiative. And there are over 200 separate initiatives in the net zero strategy, all requiring huge investment, all requiring huge resources for workforce development and for deployment. And if you take a look at that, what we need to accomplish in the next 15, 20 years, that equates to a growth rate of 10 to 20%. And that's on an annual basis. And that's 3 to 6 times our current growth rates, and in fact, doubling the size of the industry every 3 to 7 years for the next 25 years. Now that's a really daunting challenge, okay? And every year we delay this, okay, means that the increase in growth has to increase. So you can get very depressed when you look at, how daunting this task is, okay? But then you take a look at how technology adoption has happened in the past, and it can happen really quickly once it's underway. And I think we're just at the very starting points of getting this huge technology adoption started. So we're going to see that increase quite quickly. But given these projected high growth rates, it's going to be critical to build that collaboration to resolve all the business growth challenges that we're going to be facing. Next slide. And one of the things we've come across in looking at, the industry's, opinion or thoughts about how do we maximize growth, it has come across very obvious, okay, that everyone feels that there's a gap in how well we collaborate and work together, and that there's value in exploring how we can do this better. And this has resulted in putting in the net zero strategy, okay, a number of recommendations to build up the green industries in Toronto. So one of those was to look at how the city government, next slide. So one of those in the short-term actions was to look at how our city government can support the green industries and its partners in collaborating better to overcome the barriers and challenges and maximizing opportunities for growth while accelerating adoption. And we'll be exploring some of those ideas, okay, a little bit later with the panel. Next slide. Yep. Okay. And finally, I do mention when we talk about the green sectors, okay, I've changed from just calling it a sector, okay, because it is so diverse and, has so many different parts. And this is really a strength, okay, but it's also, and it's a strength, okay, because it creates all sorts of opportunities for creativity that can lead Canadian companies, Toronto companies, to develop global leading environmental solutions. But it's also a challenge in that it's hard to build consensus going forward. We have lots of organizations trying to build collaboration between individual parts of the industry, but there's a need to start looking at all of the environmental initiatives as one industry and building from that. But for this reason, we've split the consultations next week into sessions based on how we can categorize the green industry. And then we're going to have a wrap-up section, which will bring key stakeholders together from all the different sectors to start talking about the collaboration. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Elisa.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you for that context. That's very interesting. I'd like to hand it over to James Nolan, who is the Executive Director of the Environment and Climate Division at the City of Toronto.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks very much for having me here today to speak to our Transform TO Net Zero strategy. I was just looking through the participants list and recognizing a lot of names in a really great group here. For the challenges that Rob spoke to, I'll speak a little bit, but the opportunities that we have as well. And I think that the basis of the climate strategy we have and the work that we're doing really is around that collaboration. The climate crisis we're dealing with is going to require heavy lifting from all of society, and partnerships and collaboration are going to be critical and key to how we actually move forward, and we move forward at pace that is needed to actually address this crisis and the work that needs to be done. We know kind of as a city, there's a lot of factors and challenges that are outside of our control, whether it's in terms of market transformation, broader labor force considerations, consumer education and awareness. But these are areas that we can influence and we can partner with, and we can work with other levels of government, the private sector, clean tech companies, and others to help move forward on this. And I think that's really a key element of this collaboration and the partnership in terms of getting to really all of our goals as it relates to climate change. And we have lots of good examples of that, and I'll get into a little bit of our work later. But for us, we have a Green Will program, which is a partnership that we've had with large building owners across the city, really to accelerate efforts to reduce emissions. We've seen obviously our waterfront revitalization, lots of different partners there working on various projects that are going to be really groundbreaking and innovative in the city. Partnership with colleagues in the Mars Discovery District through their Mars Climate Impact Challenge, and working directly with the city to support new opportunities to reduce emissions in our own corporate buildings and fleet and other areas. Partnerships with Noventa and the University Health Network for the world's largest raw wastewater energy transfer system at Toronto Western Hospital. And I can go on and on about all the partnerships, but I wanted to highlight those at the outset because, again, it's incredibly important, this concept of partnership, because how we get to our goals, it's not one level of government, and it's not government, just as in itself. It is really a partnership of all the actors in society that's needed to move forward. And that gets us to our Transform TO goals and our net zero strategy. So next slide. I'll touch kind of at the highest level of this. So our strategy, as I said, net zero by 2040. So incredibly ambitious, but necessary goal in terms of addressing the climate crisis. And along that path to 2040, we also have targets for 2025 and 2030, as well as specific goals, including cutting our community-wide emissions in half by 2030. And we're on our way. We're making good progress, but we're getting into the part really with the heavy lifting. We've got 17 to 18 years left in terms of what needs to be done, and just a significant amount of work in the scope and scale of what we're talking about in the City of Toronto. And the opportunity around that is just south of 500,000 buildings that are going to need retrofits to reduce their fossil fuel use to zero. Right now we have around 1 million automobiles, single passenger vehicles in the city, other commercial vehicles that will need to either transition the people who use those methods of transportation into other forms of low carbon transportation, be it transit, active transportation, or switch those vehicles into zero emission vehicles. But just that gives a sense of the scope that we're looking at within the City of Toronto alone. But we're not alone. We know that municipalities across the region, across the province, across the country, and around the world are taking the same actions. And there's a lot of opportunity here. Alone in the City of Toronto, we've estimated, and this is all modeling, that the cost or the investments, I should say, needed for our transition to net zero are going to be in the order of just a little bit less than $150 billion. But there's also a significant savings associated with that from operating costs of around $100 billion. But that is a significant investment and a significant opportunity. And that takes me kind of to the next slide, which is some of the modeling that we did. And Rob spoke a little bit to this as part of our Transform TO strategy, which really talked about that economic opportunity and that employment opportunity, as Rob said, averaging somewhere between 40 to 60,000 jobs a year in the transformation needed within the city related to the climate crisis. Most of that in retrofits to buildings, but also in infrastructure as well, and the work that's needed in those areas. So again, a significant opportunity, and it will of course take a fair amount of work, looking at the types of jobs we need, the training in those areas. It's going to have a change in certain types of jobs as well, and we need to prepare for that. We need to prepare in advance. And that's again a lot of the work that needs to be done and has been underway, but as we move forward over the next 18 years, really needs to start to move to scale. Next slide, please. And that kind of brings me to a slide really to a couple of thoughts around dependencies, and hopefully will spur some of the discussion to come and some of the thoughts as we think about it at the city and as we enter into this collaborative work with all of you on the line. First one, significant growth in action with a focus on equity needed. We've had and have lots of great examples, pilot projects and demonstration projects where we've shown and you've shown the ability to get to net zero. We need to move that really into scale and significant growth over the next few years to be able to meet and achieve the targets that we've set out and they're needed to address the climate crisis. And we need to do that across the city. So the focus on equity and supporting all Torontonians is going to be incredibly important. The second is actions and alignment needed from all levels of government. Obviously, in municipal government, we have control over certain levels, but we need to work very closely with our provincial and federal counterparts to ensure that the policy construct, the resources are there that helps the city of Toronto and the people of Toronto and the businesses of Toronto are able to meet that net zero future. And that's going to be incredibly important as well. The third, and this is a key element, is obviously a carbon-free electricity system. If you look at our plan and a lot of what's in there, it is around electrification, whether it's in our fuel use or in our transportation and our mobility. And the carbon-free electricity system is going to be critical to that as we make that transition. So working towards that, whether it's part of the broader transmission generation system or it's kind of behind the meter district or other types of energy systems, those will be incredibly important as well to reducing those emissions and supporting that net zero targets. Labor market shift and local supply chains. Obviously, as we talked about the scope of what needs to be done, we'll need to ensure that the skills mix and the capacity of the labor force working obviously with all of you and with many of you as leaders in this area is able to scale up rapidly to support this. And we have the supply chains in place that supports the installation of new technologies, whether they're heat pumps, electric vehicles, or other work that's underway, again, will be incredibly important. Innovative and adaptive delivery mechanisms for adopting to scale, again, going to be important as we look at how we actually get our systems up in place and how we do that work. And I think hearing from you what's needed from the city and how our processes can be nimble to support this and what we can do is going to be incredibly important. We've seen that, for example, through the pandemic, the work around a program such as Active TO, where they were able to move quickly to support the health goals that were needed as it related to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also has a benefit from a climate perspective. So I think maybe looking at that and looking at those type of examples and what can the conditions that are necessary the city can support to enable that innovation and that adaptation to happen and to happen at scale. And then I think the last piece, and this is kind of a key element, is as we think about this, and as we think about the technologies that we're adopting and the work that we're doing, we need to think about that broader environmental picture, and obviously that's incredibly important. You know, what's the demand for resources? How are those resources extracted? I think thinking beyond just the direct emissions and how we can ensure there's a positive view from a broader standpoint, that we're supporting that circular economy, and we're considering the choices that we're making and how they have how the context in which they're being made and the broader impact they have from an emissions perspective, from more of that global nature. So there's some thoughts, and hopefully will feed into the conversation that will follow. But again, I want to thank you for having me here today, and for Rob for inviting me and being able to say a few words. These are our Transform TO 2030 goals. I won't go through them, but just having them up on slide, you can see what we're aiming towards in the next 8 years, with our 2040 goals to come down the line in terms of net zero, which is a pretty straightforward goal when you look at it. So again, thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to you, Alyssa.
Thank you so much, James. That was really, really interesting to hear. Appreciate you coming. I will now hand it back over to Rob, who will be our moderator for our roundtable chat. So Rob, please take it away and introduce our speakers.
Super. Okay. And I'm really pleased that we've got 3 people that I've known for quite a while and really admire both personally and what they do in their careers. So I'm going to ask each of them to kind of give themselves a little bit of an introduction and their initial thoughts. So Mike, I'll start it off with you.
Well, thanks very much, Rob and Alyssa and all the participants today. I'm going to try to be very brief. I'm currently the local city councilor for Ward 11, University Rosedale. I've been elected since 2010. I didn't seek re-election, so I'm now looking for employment. If anyone's got any ideas, creep into my DMs. I will say, before that, I was a community organizer with Environmental Defence Canada, worked on the Green Energy Act Alliance, as well as a couple organizations that brought together diverse stakeholders. I want to say 3 quick things. 1, even in dark times, it's possible to get somewhere with organizing around an issue. The second is, the bigger the tent, the bigger the impact. And third, big tents need common foundations. Find that common ground, ditch some of the things that separate you from the other partners in the tent, and find ways to set it aside for the purpose of that common goal, the competition that may be amongst both not-for-profits, political ideologies, as well as corporations, of course. So just quickly, a story. 2012, Harper had just canceled the Eco Energy Homes program. It was dark days in the city of Toronto, in my opinion, and for energy efficiency of homes, which is something I'm passionate about. It was Mayor Ford with his brother Doug Ford in power at City Hall. Not much was going on in the spending department. The cleavers were out, a lot of cuts to programs, people very afraid to advance some of the new progressive ideas. I spent about a year organizing different stakeholders around an idea that it resulted in the home energy loan program. It was stealing an idea from the US, their paper loans, and bringing it up here to Canada. There was one example of it that had been tried in Vancouver, but without a lot of general success. We then brought together a broad-based coalition of groups that included financial institutions, environmental organizations, labor organizations, civic action, the Board of Trade, the Real Estate Board, and I'm missing a couple big groups that I'll talk. Oh, and the utilities. Brought them all together around a common message. How we did it, I won't get into now, but it was through small meetings and agreeing on things, finding those principles we all agreed on. We put forward a case. We put it forward as a jobs creator to the Economic Development Committee instead of my committee, the Environmental Parks and Environment Committee. And what happened? It got unanimous success. So at that point in time, under one of the most conservative governments we had ever had in the city of Toronto, we had what was at that point in time, I think, the only home energy retrofit support program in the country, maybe save a couple of small ones operated by utilities, not by a level of government. So I thought it was a success story about how, if you organize around an issue, despite the mountain in front of you, if you build build broad coalitions, you can make an enormous difference. Just an example of who was on those coalitions. The logos for David Suzuki Foundation, Environmental Defense, and Enbridge Gas were next to each other. They were suing each other across the country because of a pipeline, yet we figured out a way for them all to agree on those issues. So if I can overcome that at that point in time, off the side of my desk while I was a city councilor doing 101 million other things, then there's no reason why we can't help organize the sector in Toronto or the GTA to target the municipal government, the provincial government, and the federal government, because all those levels of government, I can tell you as an elected official, all those levels of government want to be able to put forward policies that will actually result in better outcomes for the environment, but most importantly, ones that make economic sense. And as voices from the business and private sector community, I think you and the many other communities that are represented here, I think by working together, you can achieve that. Thank you.
Super. And Nick, I'm going to have you go next.
Great. Here I am. Fantastic to be on this webinar. Great to be with all 100 of us. So my background is I've been involved in the sustainable enterprise investment advocacy space for, let's say, since the 20th century. And I coined this term clean tech many years ago. In fact, November 26th, this month will be the 20th anniversary of launching the clean tech movement, and we started it in Toronto with the first ever clean tech forum. And of course, it's 30 years now since the Rio Earth Summit brought the notion of sustainable development and the participation of civil society in achieving that to the table. So I'm an investor, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm an advocate. And I think I've got 4 sort of very quick things to share, and then we'll get into more of a conversation as we go through this. First is the distinction between the greening of industry versus the development of green industries. And I think that the two things are quite distinct, and we need to be very clear in our mind about that, because are we focused on decarbonization and or are we focused on economic upside? Hopefully both. The second point is that if we're going to, we need to focus on a sort of a niche to scale approach. We can't be the leading jurisdiction in every sector and every area that we think needs to be decarbonized and greened. So it's sort of a niche to scale strategy. So how do you pick that? My observation and experience over many years, including developing sort of the global clean tech ecosystem 1.0, if you want to call it that, is that we need to focus on the areas that are most problematic for us, challenging. So perhaps in Toronto, gridlock and sustainable and affordable housing would be 2 examples. And in solving those, develop the industries that we can then have exportable excellence with. And I was very struck by James Nolan's observation that there's a $150 billion cost. I think that's a $150 billion market that we're creating. And we need to be makers, not just takers. So I think I've got one more point I just wanted to share here. Yeah, and that is the convergence of the secular with the sustainable. And I think we need to look at how these 2 trends dovetail. And I'm happy to share an example around that, around the area of artificial intelligence and our capacity and capabilities here in the GTA. So I'll leave it at that for now, and then we can get into a conversation.
Super. Thanks, Nick. And I'm going to turn this over to Nikolai now.
Thanks, Rob. And like the other guys said, thanks for inviting and great to see you all. I'm honored calling in from Copenhagen, of all places, the capital who wants to be the first carbon neutral capital in the world in 2 years from now. Let's see whether that happens. I guess it's not going to happen. But anyways, that's what we're working on here. So thanks, Rob. It's been a while and really happy to be here. I saw all the titles on this slide, and let me clarify that I guess the main reason for Rob to invite me and Elisa was really my path is building the Copenhagen Clean Tech Cluster, which is called Clean today. I quit that 10 years back, and ever since I've been helping other clusters organize themselves in actually counting 45 countries worldwide. So it's really great to reach that number and still do so. I was in Kenya last week to do the same. So basically, that's what I bring my old story about Copenhagen Clean Tech Cluster, where we also established what we call International Clean Tech Network, which is a family of 15 cool clean tech clusters in all over the world. And I have to admit that I learned the name of clean tech later than you did, Nick. So I learned it back in 2008-9, where we had the COP15 meeting coming to Copenhagen. I was back then a young consultant who, in my organization, we asked ourselves, so what are we going to do when all these 192 airplanes going to come in with all the decision makers, and what are we going to show them? And that's where we decided that we better organize ourselves in Copenhagen Clean Tech Cluster. That's the short version. So really that's my background. And I guess my learning over the years have been, as you also said, many of you, that none of us have all the answers, all the solutions. We simply gotta talk together and work together and collaborate. And collaboration takes many shapes. It could be, of course, two people working together, but not least a cluster, as we're talking about today, and then anything in between there. And I guess a big part of the recipe of making people aware of this is really also the language we use, because I so many times call it multi-stakeholder engagement and community building and all this, and in many cases, people basically in the end needs to understand what we're talking about to actually jump on board. And so that's one of my points also in how to make this happen between companies, utilities, public players, universities, and people, citizens, really also getting it down to a level where it becomes easy and really clear what it brings. And I guess that's one of the discussion points later, really, what does it bring and how do we actually make it happen when we have so many different people and organizations and interests in play here. So yeah, I guess that's a short warm-up message from me, and over to you, Rob.
No, that's a great warm-up from all three of you guys. Okay, so we're going to get on into the first discussion point, and one of my favorite quotes and I've actually got it posted on my the wall, is from Margaret Mead, and it's never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. And indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And Mike, I'm going to turn this over to you, okay, because you've been involved in bringing together a number of thoughtful, committed people together, okay, with the Green Energy Alliance, supporting the establishment of the Toronto Music Advisory Council, and then bringing also the local brew pubs together. So you've got some of my favorite subjects there. So first question, and you're up first. In your experience, what are some of the specific benefits of collaboration between diverse stakeholders?
Well, I think there's a couple. One is on sort of the side of the level of knowledge that like you have by collectively coming together is far beyond what any of us can have. Like, I'm under no assumption that I'm a subject matter expert like many of you on the call, but there is something I bring to the table when in a discussion with some of you. Just like when you meet at the table with each other, you're all bringing not only a different set of knowledge, but a different set of perspectives that can build out a better view of what the world looks like. And then second, collectively, we have more power. We simply have different connections, we have different resources. And most of all, and speaking from an elected official perspective, in that time is over in my life, but that matters. Like, that really matters when they see the number of stakeholders, the range of stakeholders, how big your tent is, how big those organizations are. The bigger, the more pressure it does put on elected officials to take action. And when they see organizations that also they see in other parts of their work, so when we bring the Board of Trade or Civic Action or the real estate board, all of a sudden politicians whose number one priority isn't climate, all of a sudden go, oh, wait a second, I know this guy, and he has good things to say about half the other stuff I would support. I'm going to listen to him. So the appeal of the group is broadened politically from and publicly, I would say, because the same if you're a large coalition representing a broad base of stakeholders that have a lot within them, a lot of stakeholders and members that identify with that group, then you're just speaking to more of the more people within the community and in politics. So I think there's power there in numbers, but you do also need to make sure that you're saying something that's going to make a difference on people's lives and advancing something that has credibility. So you can't just build a wide coalition just for the sake of saying you all agree that the world is round and not flat, although not everyone agrees with that, but that the world is round. It needs to have a little bit more purpose with that. And that's where the line falls.
I'm going to cut you off. Okay. We're just gonna keep going. Okay. So Nick, I'm going to turn this over to you now.
Okay. So the question that you'd like me to answer is
Value of collaboration.
Pardon me?
The benefits of collaboration.
I mean, yeah, where do you start here? I mean, if we go back to what we did when we started the clean tech ecosystem, both locally and globally, the first point of call was simply a common base of information, and developing a common agenda that oftentimes people don't realize they have. And I find that bringing people together not only helps with that, but it also surfaces assets that each party has that doesn't realize is valuable potentially to another party. So I think collaboration just on that alone is helpful. And then as that ecosystem or cluster or community comes together, it then provides people, particularly in public life, politicians and public servants, to then get around that and enable it creates a constituency, perhaps. So I think those are some of the benefits, and then it's the benefit of having both diverse but concentrated expertise together. And again, there's magic in that, particularly as several people have already mentioned. The things we're trying to address here are cross-cutting and are complex. And I think finally now, as one of the things that has evolved in the last 20 years, perhaps, is the bringing together the S and the E. And heretofore, social sectors and environmental folks have kind of sung kumbaya together, but not really collaborated. And so now we see examples of what we need to do and how we need to do it. And there's a lot of mutual learning. And my experience so far has been when you embark on this, you find possibilities and opportunities and commonalities that weren't obvious when we were all operating in our silos. So that's off the top of my head some of the immediate benefits I see from well curated and structured collaboration.
Okay. And Nikolai.
Yeah,
you've been doing a little bit of work on collaboration as well.
quite a bit. Thanks, Rob. No, so the question was benefits of collaboration, right, Rob? So I guess my take is on it is that there are so many levels of benefits, and I think that's important as a cluster to keep in mind. So the individual company or organization will to some level look at themselves, say, what do we get out of signing up for this cluster? What comes out of it? And that's important to keep in mind when having the dialogues with them. What are their passions and what are their pains, so to say? So what is really troubling them, or what are they looking for, and what keeps them awake at night, and so on. And then there's the more overall level, say challenges related to emissions or to water or to waste, etc. At the city level or community level, where the benefiter here is, of course, also the people, but also the city. And then there is the organization, the universities who like to get the research kind of pushed out in the market and be actually, that's kind of what they are looking for in terms of benefit. There's so many individual benefits that of course we can't serve them all, but we have to keep the question, I mean, what's in it for, the different ones. But at the same time, and that's a good point, I think that Mike and Nick also came up with this, so still also defining the overall kind of goal of stuff. So to really, what are the leading stars that actually can makes us gather towards a bigger purpose, which at the same time also brings benefit to the individual organization. Right. So on. So I think that's actually, and then the benefits can become, everything from business to innovation to access to a market to a new partnership with our R&D institution that made our path to market quicker, and so on and so forth, and then become overall kind of even green branding and impact, of course, also on the benefit side. Yeah.
Good. And I'm going to move us on to the second point, or second discussion point, just to keep us on track on time. And Nick, I'm going to have you lead this off on that. And you launched Cleantech Group, as you mentioned, in 2002. And in one of your bios, it says that the Cleantech Group helped convene 10,000 decision makers around the world. And that's a heck of a lot of people. It also states that, but I mean, you take a look at, the numerous boards that you've been on, you were chair of WaterTap, you're involved in the Clinton Global Initiative, you've advised the Singapore Economic Development Board. So you've had a lot of opportunities working in the private sector, with governments and in society. So my question to you to start this off is, how does collaboration happen differently in the private sector versus what I call civil society, environmental groups or, community groups, or is there a difference?
Well, just, slightly humorously, I'm not sure there are 10,000 decision makers in this space, and if there were, we'd be a lot better off. But a lot of prevarication, potential decision makers, I should say. So all joking aside, there's so many ways to try and answer this question. I think one of the benefits of concentrating effort through collaboration at a sort of defined, sort of place-based level is that it attracts attention. And it indicates that there's a sort of an expertise that's coalescing, and I think it attracts the best and bright minds. It attracts all those kind of things. But the difference in the private and civil society, I often feel like it's more competitive in civil society than it is in the private sector. And that's because resources are much scarcer. The ability to get attention is much harder. I often, and there's often very sort of profound ideological or conceptual differences that inhibit collaboration. In the private sector, often it's the economics that drive it. And if you can line those up, sort of rational self-interest can be helpful, can drive things forward. It often takes a lot longer, I think, in the private sector to have people understand there's a mutuality there, whereas in civil society that's more apparent. So I think it can take longer to get the private sector going, but once it does, it really moves. I think the key to it all, though, is you need to have 2 or 3 sort of leading institutions or entities. It could be a corporation, it could be a leading academic institution, it could be the top think tank in its area, whatever, or more grassroots illustration. But I think you need to have leaders who are the growth poles, as it were, and and can play a hosting role beyond what government can do.
Good. Nick, I think this leads into you nicely. Okay, so I'll let you, answer this next.
Me, right?
Yep.
Yeah, great, thanks. Just want to be sure.
But we'll have Nick the Elder and Nick the Younger.
Yeah, Nick and Nick. Yeah, so private versus civil society. I think when I thought about it the other day, I mean, I just came in from a big thing in Kenya last week, where I worked exactly, I mean, 3 days actually in a big group with 120 people, half from private and second half from civil society, about water and sanitation issues in Kenya. And I guess what I learned there is, I mean, yeah, I guess I agree to the points of pace and tempo and all that, and all that. But still, I think really the differences are not so big in my experience in terms of how it works in the private and the civil society space. The difference really is, I mean, the drivers are very different, as you also said, Nick. So very often an economic driver in companies, but actually I'm seeing that change also for many companies, that they, at least that's what they say in their websites and in speeches, that if they only did this for the money, they wouldn't be in business tomorrow. If they do this to impact, etc., they will be in business tomorrow. So that rhetoric is also coming in, but definitely I'm impressed by what I see in the civil society and NGOs and so on, organizations really being drivers for innovation, and increasingly taking really, or inviting the private sector in to stimulate and accelerate their development. So actually I think the most interesting thing is to merge the two, the private businesses and the civil society somehow, to really make them communicate and learn and innovate together, because the civil society often has a better feeling of what's going on, where the challenge is, where the private company also often have some of the solutions. So really bringing that and finding the models for bringing those guys together in a clever way, that's really where I often see magic happens. And that's me. And then the value, of course, is still for the company's money, but also impact, engagement, innovation, and solving of real problems out there. I mean, stimulated by collaboration between the two.
Okay.
Rob, can I add on to that very briefly?
Let's go to Mike, and then we'll definitely do a round table this time.
Okay.
Mike.
All I would add to that is, and I've had the benefit of working with industry associations and civil society groups in advancing policy, is the legitimacy that the private interests bring to the civil voice, and vice versa, because those private voices are also always seen as being, just like Nicholas said, they're self-serving. It's about the economics of it. Whereas the altruistic voices of civil society, if we can make that assumption, that are there because it's the right thing to do. Once you combine those two, boy, oh boy, talk about climate change. You are moving the wind. You are moving the seas. You are pushing the boat of government in that direction, and it all of a sudden legitimizes some of the decisions that governments are able to make. They're able to go further than they would have before, because they can demonstrate that civil society and the economy are behind these shifts. But to an early point Nicholas made, also having and cultivating those influential champions, finding people in government. I've had to do it before, where I go and find a staff person here at City Hall to say, you're going to be my champion on this, and here's why. And you need that champion internally, and then you go to Civic Action or to the Board of Trade, or to Build, and say, you're going to be my champion from the private sector, and here's why. And then we bring the political champion in, and all of a sudden all those sectors of society are steering the ship in the right direction. So by bringing those two, to Nikolai's last point, by bringing the civil society and economic interest together, boy oh boy, can you start shifting the wind of change.
Nikolai, Nick, do you want to add to that?
No, I'll hold on that for now and let you keep the flow going there, Rob.
Okay. We do have a little bit of time, so we can go one more time around on this question. So, Nikolai, did you have anything?
Yes, that I mean, one point, maybe it's it's related at least. I think in all this, you know, I believe that I mean there's always a level of collaboration, whether you think local, city of Toronto, or a quarter, or a place, versus and how to really find the solutions and stimulate collaboration in a city or in a part of the city or in even a subsector, versus how do you stimulate collaboration beyond that. So I mean, even in a city with so many entrepreneurs and companies and organizations, you won't have all the answers anyway. So how to both make sure to really stimulate the collaboration between people in the city and really where you have the, you know, the proximity. It's easy to run over the street and have a coffee with your with researcher and a company, versus how do we really get the rest of Canada and Canadian cities with their experience engaged in this and even spread the great solutions from Toronto out there, and even get their, not only the Danish, but even the international, I mean, stimuli and inspiration also, you know, captured and engaged somehow. So we really, you know, get that push into the whole innovation process also. And I think that's an interesting point also in this regard to bring in, and that's both also the private companies, but also the rest of the stakeholders we were talking about, you know.
Okay. Now on to the third and final kind of point or discussion. And Nikolai, I'm going to have you lead this one off. Okay. And I'm, you know, pleased that you could make it here today. We've chatted many times about working together, and we've had a couple of opportunities. And having worked with the city of Copenhagen and being kind of the driving force behind the founding of the Clean Cluster, you've got some good expertise in establishing collaboration networks. So we're going to start with you on that, okay? And it's basically is what you're experiencing in establishing a collaboration framework or network, you know, and really focusing on that, you know, what I call cluster ecosystem.
Great, cool. Yeah, and thanks, Rob, and apologize, my dog is barking out there, so maybe you hear it. No, so sharing at least in the short version, and then I'll be happy to send links and stuff. But I mean, the story of Copenhagen Clean Tech Cluster back in 2008, where we started, was really based on ourselves taking our time to do it right. And I think I said that before we went on. I mean, congrats, Rob and team for really doing this, because it's about taking the right steps at the right time and take your time. So what we did really, what I still do when I work with clusters and building them is I have this 8-step model, where the first steps are really super important to spend time on. The first steps takes more time than the rest. So the first step really is to understand the cluster. That means what are the building blocks? And I'm always saying, you don't build a cluster, you have a cluster and then you organize it. So you can't do it in a green field, right? So really spend time on who are the entrepreneurs, who are the R&D institutions, what are the big companies, who are the utilities, etc. And also spend time on, as you indicated in the beginning, Rob, really, do we need to put boundaries? I mean, in terms of how many sectors and subsectors, or do we go broad, right? And that's part of, and that's what comes out of the mapping, where you see what is the really, I call it know your cluster, right? Because before you know your cluster, the second step would be build knowledge about what's cooking out there. So what's on their minds, what's troubling people and organizations, what kind of passions and pains do they have? What kind of needs do they have? And when you understand who they are and what they are and what they're looking for in terms of passions, pains, that's where you know the patient and you can start curing it, so to speak. And that's where you can actually gather stakeholders in a room. Start small. I would advise with 5 to 10 key organizations that you learned, wow, these guys have more fire in the eyes than the rest. Some won't understand it in the early stages, some will. And really use that group to shape the vision and the mission, the goals, at least on an overall level. Because when you know where you want to go with the vision and mission goals, you can start really designing, and that's step 4. What are we going to do about it? So in other words, what kind of actions do we take here? And that requires the first 2 steps, because you won't do something which is already being done. Maybe you will, because it's being doing badly or poorly. But as a main rule, you want to know, who can I build on in the cluster? So I, as a small cluster organizer, don't have to do everything, but I know who is actually doing what, and my job is to make them do it together and doing better, and then invent what is not being done, so to speak, and find somebody to do it, or do it yourself. The last 4 steps, the short version is then, of course, you have to fund it. So the financial part is very important. Otherwise, we can talk from here to eternity. We need the funder, which can be always. I would recommend a mix of public, private, and foundation philanthropicals, maybe sponsors, maybe some paid services, and then the rest is, of course, communication. How do you organize yourself so you don't have to do everything, but have strong partners which can be other organizations in the cluster, having working packages of roles. And the last step really is, which go overall everything, is make sure to have clear KPIs and measure them. So what you measure is what you do. So many don't understand the value of partnerships and clustering, but if you really make sure to spend time in the early stages of what do we want to end up, is it more entrepreneurs, is it attracting foreign direct investments, is it to get more R&D out in the market, is it to grow is it to go international, is it to stimulate innovation in terms of energy and etc. Right? So make sure, because that makes everything more clear for everybody. I guess time is running, so I'll leave it here, right?
And Mike, I'll turn it over to you, because you've also been involved in the establishment of a number of frameworks for stakeholders.
Yeah, I think just very, very briefly, it's about defining what the problem we're trying to solve is. And in this case is, what benefits can we accrue towards the goal of economic success and shared prosperity through reducing our GHG emissions? It's a problem, but it's also a solution, and it could be framed in those exact 2 same ways. But we've got to define that. So examples of where it's worked before, and Nikolai probably has dozens of examples of other municipalities or jurisdictions that have done it. We need to communicate to these sectors why what benefit will be from organizing, because you look at district energy systems are a great example. Why we don't have more lobbying specifically to municipal regions in the GTA, because we stand to benefit, they stand to benefit, but there's no one, there's no active agent on their behalf doing that local advocacy that is really, really sorely needed.
Okay,
but that can change.
I'm going to cut you off, okay, because I'm being buzzed that we got to move along. And Nick, okay, Eddie, 30 seconds. Okay, Eddie, wrap up.
Well, I would have loved to have heard Nikolai and Mike both go a little longer. I think
I would too.
But just I want to shine a light on the hidden assets that I think collaboration surfaces. Business people often don't realize the strength of civil society, and in terms of relationships and social capital and and insight and knowledge. And so I think it's sort of the key to a cluster, successful clusters, having the whole stack at the table. So having policy, of course, and people who can talk about what would move the needle on policy, but finance, tech, civil society, having all those people there, and then surfacing the assets that each brings, I think is incredibly empowering and a great step towards developing a successful cluster.
Perfect. Okay. With that, I'm going to thank you all. Okay, and flip that back over to Lisa.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you to all our speakers. That was a very interesting discussion. Really appreciate you all being here. So next steps, we've got a lot of questions about this in the chat. As Toronto's green sectors, we really want to hear your input on how increased collaboration can be of the most value to you. So this is launching a whole industry consultation process. During this process, we'll be conducting industry sessions beginning next week. So each session will be specific to one of Toronto's green sectors, which we spoke about earlier, and will include diverse participants from a variety of organizations within the sector. Some invitations have already been sent out, but if you would like to request to attend one of the sessions and you have not gotten an invite, a form will be sent out in an email after this webinar to everyone to follow that process. So please fill out the form and we will get back to you with details on the sessions. I will also be conducting a survey of industry. So a link to this survey will be emailed also after this session. So we would encourage everyone to please fill this out to have your voice heard on the same topic. And along with that request to attend form and the survey, a recording of this session will also be sent via email to all participants. And in the long term, all of the findings from this consultation process will be consolidated into a report, which will be used to develop recommendations presented to council on the best path forward to support increased collaboration among the green sectors in Toronto, and in what form and by what mechanism that might be. And on that note, thank you all very much for joining us today. We're very excited to work collaboratively on this topic, and we thank you to all speakers who joined us, to Rob, to Susan, James, Nicholas, Nikolai, Mike. We all thank you so much for joining us, and we will be in touch.